Let's go back to the European Union. Why or how did you become hooked to the European Union?
Well, I wouldn't say I've become hooked. In fact, my appointment came out of the blue. President Barroso saw me on television and was impressed with what he heard. This was back in 2010 when the euro crisis was kicking off, and this was a crisis that Commission officials had failed to foresee and seemed incapable of solving. So he was looking for an alternative perspective, and that's why he invited me to come work for him, which is what I've been doing for the past 3 years, and now I'm returning to be a free agent again.
What do you think of the current state of the EU? Are we at the top of the integration level? Is it going to fall down in the next 2 years? What's your expectation?
I think that the EU is in deep trouble. I think that as a result of the crisis, politicians, both at a national level and a European level, inability to deal with it, decisions they've taken which have created a deep sense of injustice, prioritizing the interests, say, of French and German banks over a wider citizenry, launching into self-defeating austerity, and a general detachment from the pain, suffering, and anxiety that most Europeans feel, has led to a disenchantment with the European Union. And you can see, I mean, the Eurobarometer figures are striking, a collapse in trust in the EU, and remarkably, a belief that integration in Europe has actually been negative for their national economy. And this is across the European Union. In fact, you see now there is the support for the European Union is lower in France than it is even in Britain. So I think the EU is in very deep trouble, and it needs to change. I haven't lost my optimism about the future. I strongly believe that decline, stagnation, and a breakup of the European Union are not inevitable, but that things need to change in order to build a brighter future. So I think I'm realistic in saying current conditions are awful. They're less bad than a year or two ago, but they're still awful. That the political backlash against the economic crisis is only just beginning, and that it is the duty of anyone who truly believes in Europe not to unquestionably agree with whatever is decided in Brussels, but to say, no, this is not the kind of Europe that we want. We want a different kind of Europe. We want a better Europe, and here is how we set out to do it. Because at the moment, the only people who are providing alternatives are the extremist, populist anti-Europeans, and they're offering a false diagnosis and a false solution. So what you need is a coalition of the radical centre to say, no, this is a different kind of Europe that we need to build. The EU policy establishment is captured by the interests of the banking sector, and that as a result, the interests of citizens have been placed second to those of the banking sector. And that's obvious, for example, in the case of Ireland, where the cost of bailing out the banks is equivalent to half of its national income, and the ECB threatened to force Ireland out of the euro if the Irish government didn't continue to guarantee all Irish bank debt. Secondly, I think as a result of the mistaken bailout of Greece, there has been a huge centralisation of fiscal powers in Brussels. And I think that is economically dangerous, because when you share an interest rate and a currency, you need more fiscal flexibility, not less. And I think it's politically problematic, because the idea that you can take decisions about taxation and spending out of the hand of elected politicians and put it in either on autopilot through rules or in the hands of unelected bureaucrats who are remote from the decisions and the consequences at national level, I think is dangerous. You know, the no taxation without representation is what leads to revolution. That means, one, we need a change of policies. Above all, we need a much more democratic European Union. You know, the Eurosceptics say the EU is undemocratic and therefore we need to devolve powers back to a national level. The people in power now say, you know, things are pretty much okay and we might need some changes here and there, but basically just shuffling the deck chairs. And I said, no, we've reached a level of integration now where we need to have much greater democracy. And democracy, it means, first of all, much greater openness and accountability, but secondly, it means genuine choice. I mean, if you've seen throughout this crisis, you've had government after government that is thrown out, and the first thing that happens when the new government is elected is Olli Rehn or someone pops up and says you have to stick to the previous policies. And voters naturally say, well, hang on a minute, you know, we have a right to decide our future. So we have a new commission, we have European elections in May, we have a new commission coming in. We need to have a genuine debate about, you know, an alternative prospectus for the next 5 years, a genuine debate about the stuff of politics. What kind of Europe do we want to build over the next 5 years, and make that the subject of the European elections. I think the Eurozone is not out of the woods by any means. Our banking crisis is unresolved. Private sector debt, which is the main problem in Europe, is no lower than it was 6 years ago. So we've had a lot of pain and very little progress. Economies are now in a very, very, very weak recovery, a recovery that is not strong enough to meaningfully bring down unemployment and not strong enough to make paying off debts a meaningful prospect. So I think the economic situation remains grim, and lots needs to be done.
Okay. Are we going to lose the race with the BRICS in the next 20, 30 years?
I think the idea of a race is a misconception. A race suggests that there's a winner and a loser, when actually international exchange is a win-win. I think it's a fantastic thing. You know, certainly when I grew up, there were many campaigns to combat global poverty, and the assumption was the best that you could do was basically alleviate the misery of the people in the developing world. And actually, over the past 20 years, we've seen this amazing growth, so that, you know, hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty, not just in China and India, but also in Africa. That's an amazing development. Unfortunately, it's led to this reaction that people in these countries are doing so well that we perceive it to be a threat. And clearly, the global economy is changing, and Europe, as well as others, need to adjust, not just because of the rise of China, but also through, you know, new digital technologies which are revolutionizing almost every industry. And we need to have a positive attitude and grasp the opportunities that are out there, while helping those people who lose out initially from the change to adjust. What is clear is that long before the crisis there has been a slowdown in productivity growth and a fall off in investment, which means that even after the crisis, even after we emerge from the crisis, economic growth is likely to be slow, especially because societies are aging and workforces are shrinking. So if you combine slow productivity growth and shrinking workforces, you almost end up with stagnant economies. That tells us that we need to change. We need to invest much more in the future. We need to be much more accepting of competition and change. And we need to have a much more entrepreneurial attitude. And in that sense, actually, I mean, if there is a silver lining to this crisis, is that there are millions and millions of young people now, 15 million actually across Europe, who are neither in employment nor education. Yeah. These people have nothing to lose from starting out on their own. And it is the duty of policymakers everywhere to help them on their way, whether it is connecting them to networks of entrepreneurs and mentors, or whether it is changing regulations so that it's easier to start a business. This actually could be some compensation for the terrible crisis that we've suffered over the past 6 years. I think Eurozone policymakers, including the European Commission, have made disastrous policy mistakes in recent years. They have failed to solve the real problems, which is the banking crisis and excessive private sector debt, and they have created new ones, both the financial panic in the Eurozone, which the ECB has now resolved, and this headlong rush into austerity, which has led to higher public debt rather than lower public debt, and the unemployment crisis which is around Europe, but particularly in southern Europe, where you have catastrophic figures. More than 1 in 4 Greeks and Spaniards unemployed, nearly 3 in 5 young people, a lost generation in the making. And no, there isn't a sense of urgency. And I think part of the problem is that, first of all, EU institutions have been hijacked by Germany, and Chancellor Merkel thinks no pain, no gain. Secondly, that EU officials are detached from the people whose decisions, the people on who the European officials are detached from the people who their decisions affect. So you have jobs, you have a job for life, you have a gold-plated pension. You only talk to people who work for EU institutions or lobbyists who want money or a rule change that benefits them. And unemployment in Southern Europe is just numbers on a spreadsheet. And that's part of the problem. It's precisely for that reason that we need to have A, a change of policies, and B, much greater democracy.
So you didn't really enjoy being inside the Euro bubble in the last few years? You're describing a disconnect.
Personally, I've learnt a lot from my time here. I've learnt how the EU institutions work. I've met lots of interesting people. I've tried to push policy in the right direction. President Barroso and I have had stimulating discussions where he's been open to my points of view. I've had some influence on decision making. For example, it was my idea to increase the capital of the European Investment Bank in order to provide some kind of fiscal stimulus to offset the austerity at a national level. I'm fought to get it into the President's State of the Union speech in September 2011. And when President Hollande was elected in 2012 and they were looking for new ideas to boost growth, this was taken up by the European Council in June 2012. So that is a proud achievement, I can say. At least I've helped to push the debate in the right direction. Clearly, I haven't had as much influence as I would have liked, or at least clearly the policy direction that has been taken is not the one that I would have taken. But at the same time, I think there has been genuine changes in recent years. You can see finally the ECB intervened to stop the financial panic. There is less austerity than there was. There is a hope that finally some of the problems in the banking sector are going to be tackled with the ECB's asset quality review this year. But there's still a hell of a lot to do. There's still a flawed diagnosis of what the problems are, and there's still a lack of urgency. As I said, we had potentially a lost generation is in the making. If you come out of school or university and you fail to get a job when you're unemployed for 5 years, by the time the economy recovers, if it does recover, there's a whole generation of younger people who are going to take those entry jobs in the labour market. And if you look at economic studies, we don't have any recent experience of anything as bad as this, but if you look at economic studies, they show that basically many people's whole career is scarred. They never actually catch up what they've lost. And that is tragic for those young people individually, and the social and political consequences are potentially very worrying. So yes, we need a much greater sense of urgency.
What do you think will happen at the next elections of the European Parliament in May 2014? Is this going to be about a sense of urgency? Is it going to be a pro-contra Europe vote? We will see a lot of rise in populist parties. What do you think?
Well, obviously, opinion polls are never perfect, and trying to predict the result of 28 separate elections is rather difficult. All the polls suggest that there's going to be a rise in support for anti-EU, typically far-right parties, sometimes far left. And how big that vote will be, who knows? I think part of the problem is that there's a misconception that the European Parliament doesn't have much power, and therefore you can cast a protest vote with hardly any consequences. And since the Lisbon Treaty, the European Parliament has co-decision power with the European Council, and therefore actually it has a hell of a lot of power. But secondly, I think the problem is, as we discussed before, the lack of a genuine political debate about the future of Europe, and therefore people don't associate the European elections with, I'm going to shape what form Europe will take over the next 5 years. They take it as a chance to cast a protest against the national government, or in many cases simply to stay away.
Is it going to affect European policy making in the next few years then? Are we going to get a less liberal Europe, for instance?
That's the risk.
Yeah.
That's certainly the risk. I mean, I don't think it's highly unlikely that any of these extremist xenophobic parties will be able to take office in any country alone. Of course, they've been in coalition or in supporting role, for example, in the Netherlands or in Denmark or in Austria and so on. But the main risk is how mainstream parties react. And you can see that on the centre-left, people are worried that working class voters who used to vote for them are now increasingly attracted by the far right. And you see on the centre-right, people who say, well, these social conservative nationalistic voters actually belong with us. And you can end up with a tipping point where on both sides of the political spectrum, you end up echoing the views of the far right. And once you get to that stage, it's a very worrying development.
Looking forward to going back to London soon?
I'm looking forward to going home, and I'm looking forward to trying to set up my new think tank called Open Political Economy Network, to focus on the issues that I think are deeply important to not just Europe's future, but the world's future. I'm looking forward to the publication of my new book, European Spring, Why Europe's Economies and Politics Are in a Mess and How to Put Them Right.
Good luck with these 3 big projects.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.